As the train pulled away from the station, I pulled out my smartphone and opened the Notes app. I smiled as I looked down the list of challenges I'd set myself. As a closeted crossdresser, I'd long had a bucket list of things I wanted Julia to achieve, but I'd never had the courage to fulfill any of them. At least not until the start of the week, when I found myself in the house alone thanks to my wife having gone overseas to stay with her sister for a week. I really don't want to say much about my wife because the truth is I don't have much to say. Well, not much positive anyway. The spark in our marriage died over a decade ago, and life now is pretty much a constant battle with her chipping away at my self-esteem. So even if I hadn't had big plans for Julia, a week of peace and quiet was to be treasured. But I did have big plans for Julia. And the first couple of items on the list had almost been an anticlimax. Go for a nighttime walk had been nerve-wracking as I prepared for it, but as soon as I was outside my front door, my fears vanished. As I heard the click of my heels on the pavement and felt the breeze on my nylon legs, everything just felt so natural that when I returned home, I jumped in the car and drove to the local supermarket, where I picked up a couple of packets of tights and a lipstick. The self-checkouts ensured that I didn't need to interact with any of the staff, not that they'd have had much to go on, given that I'd taken advantage of the COVID mask mandate to cover my face. So that was go to a shop and buy something crossed off the list too. And now, as I felt the sensation of uncharacteristically long hair gently caressing my shoulders and caught my reflection in the train window, I could cross 2 more items off the list. Go for a makeover and go out in daylight. This was becoming too easy. I'd gone for a makeover for 2 reasons. Firstly, I wanted to see just how good I could look as a woman, and the answer to that was beyond my wildest dreams. I don't know how she did it, but Susie the makeup artist managed to erase every last square millimeter of maleness and turn me into a woman I'd have dated at the drop of a hat if I'd met her while out and about. As for the second reason for the makeover, I wanted to look my best for what was going to be the most challenging thing on the list so far: come out to a friend. The question of who I'd trust to tell my secret to had played on my mind for years. The last thing I wanted to do was to feel that I had to swear someone to secrecy after dropping a bombshell about myself. I also knew that if my confidence was betrayed, there'd be significant implications, not least for my marriage such as it was. I really had absolutely no need to tell anyone, but as time went on I realized that I needed to talk to someone, if only to get the pent-up frustrations off my chest. In the end, I decided that Kelly was my best bet. She's beautiful, intelligent, and most important of all, discreet. But she's also happily married, and I wasn't entirely sure how she'd react to being asked to meet me, and how her husband would feel about her going out with another man for the evening. But in the end, I took a deep breath and asked her if we could meet, as there was something I needed her advice on. I asked her to come alone, but reassured her that neither she nor her husband would have anything to worry about, for reasons that would become apparent when we met. After talking it over with her husband, which I'd encouraged her to do, she agreed. So the makeover was also for the benefit of my meeting with Kelly later that evening. Firstly, so that I could look my absolute best, and secondly, so that she wouldn't have any sense of embarrassment as people looked at the person in a dress she was out with. And as the train announcement indicated that we were arriving at my station, I gathered my things and prepared myself for the short walk home. I started my car for the drive into town, but noticed that the fuel gauge was nearly on empty, so I drove to the nearest petrol station to fill up. As I filled up my car with fuel, I noticed a well-dressed man at the adjacent pump repeatedly glancing at me and smiling as he did so. I couldn't help feeling a little envy as I looked over at his top-of-the-range Mercedes, a complete contrast to my bottom-of-the-range Ford. If I couldn't compete with his wealth, at least I could console myself with the thought that I was going to spend a great deal less than he was thanks to my Ford's fuel economy. But I have to confess that I felt both flattered and uneasy at his attention, particularly as I was certain that I'd never met him. Wearing stilettos, black sheer stockings, a body-hugging dress, and glamorously made up, it wasn't hard to understand why he kept glancing my way. But I started to realize what women have to contend with on a daily basis. They should be able to get dressed up without every man who sees them assuming they're fair game, and it can't be easy for them. But as I saw Mercedes man sneak yet another furtive glance in my direction, I was beginning to regret looking quite as good as I did. Of course, I'd sometimes fantasized about being the trophy wife of a successful businessman, but as I was now finding out firsthand, there's a raft of difference between a fanciful dream and the reality of unwanted advances. Underneath all of my feminine finery, I was still a heterosexual guy and had no interest in any romantic partners that didn't bear a strong resemblance to my own currently feminized form. As I walked to the attendant inside to pay for my fuel, my heels clicking on the hard concrete ground as I did, I couldn't help smiling to myself. I obviously looked hot enough for Mercedes man to take an interest, and what person doesn't like to feel even a little attractive? But perhaps I jumped to conclusions. Maybe he was just intrigued by the sight of a person dressed up in a feminine way. However, as I got back to my car, he appeared from what seemed like nowhere, although of course it was the pump behind the one I was using. I felt my heart beating heavily in my chest, and his broad smile indicated that the encounter was anything but accidental. "Hi," he said. I looked up briefly and smiled before looking down and hoping that would be sufficient. It wasn't, and I knew full well that any response from me would give the game away. I may have looked like every middle-aged man's dream in all my finery, but my voice would leave absolutely nothing to the imagination. Sadly, Mercedes man was nothing if not persistent. Look," he started. "I hope I didn't frighten you, but I have to say that you're the most beautiful person I've seen for a long time. If I don't invite you to go for a drink with me, I'll never forgive myself." By now my panic had turned to terror. How would he react when he realized that describing me as a beautiful woman may not have been entirely accurate? Would he just punch me in the face before driving off? Would he follow me as I drove away? Would he start a shouting match in the petrol station, calling me names? I just didn't know what to do, and in the softest voice I could muster just stammered, "I can't." But Mercedes man just stood there smiling, and then, sensing my anxiety, he spoke once more. "It's okay. I've already realized what you are, and I don't care one little bit. You're still the most beautiful person I've seen for a long time, and I'd still like to invite you for a drink." So, I'd been read. At least that meant that I wasn't going to get punched in the face or outed when he heard my voice. I took a deep breath. "I'm sorry, but I'm not interested," I stuttered. "Oh, that's a shame," laughed Mercedes man. "But I meant everything I said. You're beautiful." I breathed a sigh of relief as he drove away in the opposite direction to me, my heart still pumping hard, but deep down feeling strange sensations about what had just happened. What I'd said about not being interested was completely true, but downstairs I could feel my well-tucked manhood telling a different story as it strained to be set free, aroused by the sensuality of the situation I'd just been in. Being a weeknight, the town center was quiet, and I was able to park outside the wine bar where I'd arranged to meet Kelly. After going in, I easily found a quiet table towards the back of the bar. I ordered a bottle of wine and kept a watch on the door for Kelly's arrival. There was no way she was going to recognize me dressed like this, so I knew I was going to have to give her a little help. I'd been waiting about 10 minutes when an SMS notification popped up on my phone. "Really sorry, Rory doesn't feel well, so I have to stay at home with him. Perhaps we can reschedule." KX. Yes, of course we can reschedule. I'll just shell out another £200 on another makeover and run the gauntlet of the petrol station once again before I wait for the world's sickest heel. I poured myself the wine I'd ordered and gathered my things to go home. I'd already had one close call that evening, so there was no way I was going to hang around a wine bar alone dressed in a manner that would suggest to any hot-blooded male that I was up for it. But as I stood up to put my coat on, my heart stopped. The door opened, and who should walk through the door? Mercedes man. And as soon as he spotted me, he marched over, smiling broadly. "Leaving so soon?" "Yes," my friend cried off at the last minute, "so I'm not going to spend the evening here alone." "But you're not alone anymore," he laughed, "and it would be a shame to waste that wine. So, why don't you sit down and we can finish it together?" I wanted to protest, but knew when I was beaten. "Okay then," I sighed. "Look, I understand this is hard for you, so anytime you feel uneasy, just get up and leave. I promise I won't follow you." I relaxed a little at that point and introduced myself as Julia. "I'm James. Nice to meet you again," laughed Mercedes man as he poured himself a glass of wine and topped up mine. But it was time to address the elephant in the room, so I started. You know that I'm a person who dresses in a feminine way, so why were you so keen to meet me for a drink? Doesn't it bother you? Absolutely not, he replied, still laughing. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that it's that and the fact that you look so good that made me want to get to know you better. You mean you're attracted to people who dress in feminine ways? I asked incredulously, as I started to feel very nervous about the situation I now found myself in. Well, admirer is the more polite term, but whatever you want to call me, the answer is yes. I am attracted to people who dress in feminine ways. I felt panic starting to build up inside me. Like most other people who crossdress, I've joined online communities hoping to meet like-minded individuals, but wherever these communities congregate, you're sure to find the chasers lurking in the shadows. They're not all the same, of course. Some have such a high opinion of themselves that they assume that every trans person they approach is eager to experience their superior lovemaking skills. Others just come over as love-struck teenagers, obsessed with and showering compliments on the objects of their desire. One or two just appeared to be respectful, but they were few and far between, and quite possibly just better at hiding their true intentions than the other types. Whichever category they fell into, they were probably holding the mouse with one hand and engaging in inappropriate behaviors with the other. Even the thought of it made me feel physically sick, a feeling that I was now experiencing once again as the horror of what I'd let myself in for sunk in. Sensing my unease, James started to explain. When it comes to choosing a partner, we all have different preferences. Some like dark-haired people, some like blondes, some like light-skinned people, some dark. Some people are straight, others are attracted to the same sex, and so on. I just happen to find people who dress in a feminine way attractive.
Why?
Because we're guys underneath. Not exactly. That would just be tantamount to saying that I'm attracted to the same sex, which I'm not. But if you like men, then surely you're attracted to the same sex regardless of how they're dressed. Fair point, laughed James. But let me ask you a question. You're having a drink with a guy. Does that make you attracted to the same sex? No, it doesn't, and you know that, I snapped. Really? The smirk on James's face told me that he was not buying that. I've left you in no doubt that I'm attracted to you and reassured you that you can leave at any time, but you're still here. And don't tell me it's just to finish the wine. I felt myself blushing. The truth was that he had a point. While on the one hand, I felt no attraction towards him, on the other I was turned on by the situation. I liked the idea of a smartly dressed couple enjoying a drink together, and I also liked the idea of being treated as a lady by an admittedly decent-looking guy. And once again, the arousal I was feeling downstairs suggested that while my head was telling me that I had no interest whatsoever in dating another man, my heart may have a different view. So maybe James was justified to ask that question. If I was asking him if he was attracted to the same sex, I was acknowledging that I was a guy out with another guy on what was to all intents and purposes rapidly turning into a date. But I temporarily stopped being a guy for the evening. In my mind, I was all woman and expected to be respected and treated as such. But that's different, I replied. This evening I look like a woman and I feel like a woman, and at no point have I said that I'm attracted to guys. But equally, you haven't said that you aren't, retorted James, quick as a flash. Of course I wanted to quash that particular idea, but I couldn't find the words, not least as I now felt my cheeks burning as I blushed. James sensed my unease. Look, he said, you look beautiful tonight, and you've obviously made a huge effort to be the best you can be, and I respond to that, particularly as many people nowadays just can't be bothered making the effort. Of course the thought of your transformation is exciting, perhaps even a turn-on if you want me to be really honest. But if that makes me attracted to the same sex in your eyes, I'll take that in return for spending time with someone who I find incredibly attractive.
Wow.
I wasn't expecting that, and strangely, I didn't feel threatened by what James said. In fact, I found his honesty disarming. And, of course, he was right. If I wanted to be treated as a woman, I couldn't then accuse him of being attracted to the same sex. But James wasn't finished. So, let me ask you a question. Why do you do this? What makes someone who identifies as male want to not only dress up as a woman, but as the most glamorous woman they can be? If only I knew the answer to that question. I'd been asking myself the same thing ever since I first sneaked into my sister's bedroom to try on her clothes, and was no nearer the answer now than I was then. I just knew that somehow it felt right. No, more than that, it felt good. Amazing, in fact. I don't know, I replied slowly. For most of the time it feels like I'm living with a problem that I can't quite put my finger on. I see a pretty woman in the street, and I'm attracted to her, but rather than that attraction being admiration, it manifests itself as more of a feeling of envy. So, you want to get close to her to try to live your own dreams through her, rather than just wanting to get her into bed? Yes, I replied, a little surprised about how perceptive he was. But I probably should have expected it given that he was a self-confessed admirer of people who dress in feminine ways. So, why not make the change permanently? I thought for a few moments. Why not make the change permanently? When I compared how I felt as Julia to my normal life as him, there was no contest. His life was one of drudgery and frustration. Hers somehow felt more complete. My experiences on my day out had proved that I could function in society as a female, and if I was honest with myself, I was enjoying this date far more than I'd expected. But I knew it wasn't that simple, and if I removed my rose-tinted spectacles, the reality of being a transgender person was very different to the fantasy world imagined by both the transgender community and their admirers. Because, I started slowly, I'm not really sure that it's the right thing for me. What happens when the novelty wears off? Well, replied James, smiling, I could say that you won't find out unless you make that leap of faith. But the time you took to answer that question tells me far more than the answer you finally gave me. And if there was an element of doubt in your answer, there was far more as you struggled to find a reason that would convince you yourself. Never mind me. And James was right. I was unconvinced by what I had said, and the truth was that every time I let Julia out to play, it was more difficult putting her away again. At times, I could see clearly. Enough to know that taking that step was the only way to deal with the frustrations I felt, but for most of the time, all I could see were obstacles. I mean, how could someone who identifies as male ever believe that they could become a convincing woman? And by convincing, I just mean a woman that could blend in and be accepted by society? But more fundamentally, was that really what I wanted? But more to the point, why was I still sitting in the wine bar with James? He'd already told me that I could leave at any time, and yet I was still there without any urge to get up and leave. In fact, I was enjoying his company. His interest in me obviously went a lot deeper than a passing interest in the trans community. He'd made that quite clear in the several compliments he'd paid me, but I was still trying to rationalize my own thoughts. For an older man, James was attractive. He obviously cared about his appearance and was very engaging when he talked. But that's as far as it went. I had absolutely no desire to go back to his place for a coffee before jumping into bed with him, an urge I definitely felt myself when dating in my younger days. But even so, I felt aroused with every compliment he paid me. I felt my cheeks become a little warmer and my heart beat a little stronger, not to mention what was happening down below. It reminded me of an incident with one of the girls in my class at school. Jane, or plain Jane as we called her, wasn't like the other girls. At a time when most of her classmates were making the most of the changes to their bodies and showing off their newly developed curves as adulthood beckoned, she seemed to make no effort at all. None of us were interested in her, and in any social situation always made a beeline for the other girls. Their dark eyeliner, bright red lipstick, skimpy clothing, and high heels acted like magnets for our attention, and a stark contrast to Jane's normal outfit of a plain blouse, dark trousers, flat shoes, absolutely no makeup, and hair tied tightly back in a ponytail. One Saturday night we were all at another classmate's party, and there she was again. Once again, having made no effort to highlight her femininity other than allowing her normally tied-back hair to fall freely onto her shoulders. I really didn't want to waste any time on her, as there were plenty of other girls there who I'd have dated at the drop of a hat. And so, when I went into the kitchen to get myself another drink, and she was there doing similar, I was in no mood to strike up a conversation. And yet there was something about her smile as she looked up and saw me. I caught sight of her deep blue eyes, and at that moment I was hooked. My head, of course, was telling me to get back into the other room in the hope that one of the girls who more closely conformed to my fantasy girl would come over, tell me that she couldn't control herself any longer, and passionately kiss me. And yet I couldn't go, because in my heart there was something about Jane that at that moment I found irresistible. She was interested in me, and she knew how to make me interested in her. As we talked, I became increasingly turned on by her, and I finally gave up the fight, and we shared a kiss, and then several more. Jane and I dated for a couple of months after that party, but on my part there was always a wish that she perhaps wear a little makeup or dress more like the other girls of her age. In the end, she just got fed up with me constantly encouraging her to change her image, and she dumped me. I wasn't that bothered at the time, and within 2 weeks managed to start dating another girl who conformed far more to my ideal girl. Heavy makeup, low-cut tops, short skirts, and high heels. But nothing else. No interest in me, or indeed anything other than constantly checking her makeup in the mirror or gossiping about one of the other girls in our class. After 2 weeks, I'd had enough and finished it. But despite my pleadings, it was too late for a reconciliation with Jane. I still don't know why I fell for Jane. Perhaps it was just a case that deep down I was looking for someone I could emotionally connect with, or quite possibly my interest in the other girls with their makeup, short skirts, and heels were just the early signs of my internal journey, and Jane, whose appearance was decidedly tomboyish most of the time, was a closer match to what I was really searching for in a partner, but not prepared to properly admit it for fear of the repercussions from a society that tended to frown on those things. At that time, whatever it was, I was now experiencing pretty much the same emotions as I sat opposite James and felt just as bewildered as I had done all those years ago. I was shocked when I caught sight of the clock on the wall. I'd been talking to James for over 2 hours and I hadn't noticed the time passing. We were now the only two left in the wine bar, and it was obvious that the staff were impatient to close for the night. We gathered our things, and as we approached my car, I thanked James for what had turned out to be a surprisingly enjoyable evening. That was the point at which I should have got into my car and driven off. But my heart was beating strongly in my chest. Ironically, it was exactly the same feeling I'd had when I'd connected with Jane all those years ago. Then it was my head telling me that Jane wasn't the person for me because she didn't conform to what I defined as my ideal partner, while at the same time feeling utterly attracted to her. Now it was my head reminding me that I had no interest in a romance with another man, and despite seeing that he was good-looking, I just wasn't physically attracted to James. Fundamentally, I wasn't because he was a guy. And yet as we talked, I came to realize that he was the guy that I should have been. Successful, tall, quite good-looking, well-dressed, and good company. Just the sort of guy that a woman with the same sense of style that I was exhibiting in my feminized state would go for. Because the truth is that people who care about their appearance and dress elegantly are drawn towards men like James, not downtrodden disheveled types like my normal persona. So James shouldn't have been anything more than an inspiration, a role model for me to emulate. But the truth was that I was aroused, and had increasingly been, as we talked. Like Jane, he was the complete opposite of what I wanted in a partner, but like Jane, he was interested in me. I'd often fantasized about being the woman in a heterosexual relationship during my cross-dressing sessions, and with every compliment that James had paid me during the evening, I'd felt my arousal intensify. Sure, James was a self-confessed admirer of people who dress in feminine ways, but as he'd said himself, that was just something he found attractive about certain people. My head, of course, was telling me to get into my car and drive off. It was reminding me that I was a heterosexual guy who had no interest in other guys as romantic, never mind sexual, partners. But was I really a guy, and had I just been deluding myself that I was just a crossdresser? I delighted in the feelings of femininity every time the wine bar staff called me ma'am, and I almost burst with joy when an attractive woman complimented my outfit as I was fixing my lipstick in the ladies' room, not because I desired her, but because it felt like she was accepting me into her tribe. My heart was telling me that I shouldn't repeat the mistakes I'd made with Jane, and I knew exactly what I had to do next, if only to see where my emotions sat once and for all. I looked into James's eyes, and he looked back. We said nothing for several seconds, and finally I reached up and kissed him tenderly on the lips. Again we looked into each other's eyes, and as I saw him move towards me, I closed my eyes. He gently pulled me towards him, and our lips met for a long, lingering kiss. A tingling sensation engulfed my body as he held me tight, our tongues dancing their ritual dance as we were as one with each other. And when we finally parted and went our separate ways, I realized that James had finally enabled me to resolve all of the frustrations, anxieties, and questions that had punctuated my life. The future now seemed full of possibilities, and I was determined to explore every single one of them. That evening took place 5 years ago, and yet I remember it vividly, as if it was only yesterday. I slept late the following morning, but as I looked at my bucket list on my phone, I smiled. Clearly, I'd not come out to a friend as I'd planned to do that evening, but as I scrolled down, I realized that go on a date with a guy could be well and truly ticked off as done. And most of the other items on the list now looked a lot more doable than they'd appeared a few hours earlier. And before I put down my phone, I dared to add one more item to the list at the very bottom: transition. I had no idea whether I would ever get that far down the list to remove the question mark, let alone tick it off as done, but it no longer seemed to be the impossible dream that it had once been. Within a week, I was separated from my wife. I confided in her about my crossdressing when she got back from her sister's, and it gave her the excuse to end the marriage she'd long been seeking. Granted, a dingy rented flat was a significant step down from the marital home, but it gave me all the freedom I needed to let Julia spread her wings, and spread her wings she did. And James? Well, after that kiss, it was definitely obvious where my romantic interest was going, and we soon started a proper relationship. It turned out that he came from a wealthy family and enjoyed indulging his love of people who dress in feminine ways through me. So soon I was being treated to clothing, shoes, and anything and everything else someone who identifies as female could ever have wished for. And before I forget, I should mention that he soon admitted that our chance meeting in the wine bar was anything but accidental. He'd guessed that I was heading into town, and after deliberately heading off in the opposite direction to avoid suspicion, he quickly turned around to try to find me again. He couldn't believe his luck, firstly, when he spotted my car outside the wine bar, and secondly, when he found out that I'd been stood up and was on my own. Of course, we enjoyed a full relationship, and while the fact that underneath everything I was someone who identifies as male fascinated him, his excitement when I finally decided that I wanted to go on hormones was palpable. Facial feminization and breast augmentation followed thanks to his generosity. But we then hit a problem. Call me old-fashioned, but in my view of the world, women don't have penises. I soon realized that I wanted to go all the way and have that irrelevant piece of skin, and its two rotund friends removed for good. The more feminine I became, the more I grew to detest what I had downstairs. But for James, my genitals were everything. Without them, I'd be just another woman, and not of interest to him. On that basis, he told me that there was no way he was paying for that operation. And I guess that was the point I woke up. I'd always felt adored by James, but it was now apparent that the adoration was for what I was, not who I was. He saw all of the clothes and the operations as being for his benefit, not mine. He was just creating his dream woman, and that woman had to be sexually ambiguous to satisfy him. And so when after yet another argument about my desire to undergo full gender reassignment, he issued the ultimatum that if I had that operation it would be over between us, I told him that I was not prepared to wait that long for the inevitable and ended the relationship there and then. Of course I was sad, but I guess I should have realized from the word go. Once an admirer of people who dress in feminine ways, always an admirer of people who dress in feminine ways. Fortunately, during my time with James, I'd managed to save up a few thousand and finally traveled to Thailand for my operation a couple of years ago. But best of all, Tom is now in my life. He's a lot older than me and not as good-looking or wealthy as James was, but he's everything I could ever wish for. He didn't bat an eyelid when I told him about my past, just dismissing it with, "I love you for who you are, not who you've been." And that's all I ever wanted to hear. Oh, that and, "Will you marry me?" And being married is the best thing that ever happened to me. Did you like the story? Hit that like button and tell me what you thought in the comments. Do you want to hear more stories? Subscribe and hit the bell for exclusive content and early access. Check out our Patreon. You can find the link in the description, or you can watch any of the videos shown on my right. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next.